Hey folks, Sam from the Danger Planet here, and I'm really excited to bring you a new series that we're doing called Malifaux Master Class. This series is aimed at people who have been playing Malifaux for a little bit, but maybe are trying to up their game and transition to a more competitive environment. And so we're offering some strategy advice and some tips and things you can use to maybe level up your game a bit. So if you're a really experienced player, this won't be new to you, but if you're new but looking to improve, I hope you can find something in these videos that will be helpful to you. So today we're going to be talking about deployment zones and how your choice of deployment zone affects the game. So as you can see, I've pulled up this map on Vassal. Vassal, for those who don't know, is a web client that plays a variety of games, including Malifaux. It's third party, but Weird is very supportive of it. And if you're ever looking for a game in Malifaux, but you can't get one in your local area, there's always people playing on Vassal. The community is great, it's very supportive, and I encourage you to check it out. So what you can see here is I've got this map set up, and over here I've got some strategy and scheme markers and some models to help us illustrate some things. Now we're going to start with Wedge Deployment. Wedge Deployment, as you can see, has two big pyramids here. When you deploy on Wedge Deployment, you are effectively claiming one side of the board as yours, but you can deploy out as far as 12 inches out. That means the tip of your deployment zone is a third of the way up the board. And because your opponent obviously has their own third, if you deploy at the absolute maximum extension, you are only 12 inches away from your opponent. Wedge Deployment encourages really aggressive brawling because you start so close to each other. You'll also notice if you're deploying out on the flanks, you'd have to deploy way farther back. So if you're trying to push forward, it really funnels you towards the center. Wedge Deployment, then, is a deployment that really favors crews that like sticking together and getting to grips with the enemy as fast as possible. Nekima, for example, loves Wedge Deployment. Crews that maybe don't have that level of melee punch, or crews that want to take a turn to dirtle a little bit and set their stuff up before they get to grips with the enemy, might struggle with Wedge. Now, Wedge is also a horizontal deployment. That means the center line is horizontal, which affects certain strategies. So, for example, the new Guard the Stash strategy has you place two strategy markers here. I'm not measuring them exactly, but roughly there. And then one in the center of each table quarter. So once again, I'm not measuring really exactly, but here it is. Now, with this strategy, what you're trying to do is control the markers that are not wholly on your side of the board. So in Wedge, you're trying to control the markers on your opponent's side and the markers on the center line. Now notice the maximum points you can score in a strategy is 4. So to do that, you would need to control all 4 of these markers. Wedge, on the other hand, is really, really good with Carve a Path. It's very easy to score because with Carve a Path, you have these payload strategy markers, which you're basically pushing around when you take interact actions, and you're trying to get them into your opponent's deployment zone. And they start 10 inches back from the center line, but look how close they are to the opponent's deployment zone, even 10 inches back. It only is going to take a few pushes to get them all the way in there. So schemes like Breakthrough, where you're trying to drop a scheme marker in the enemy's deployment zone, and strategies like Carve a Path, where you're trying to push through into the enemy's deployment zone, are much easier to score on Wedge than on some of the other deployments. But strategies like Guard the Stash, which I had set up here, or, for example, Covert Operations, which has 4 strategy markers on the center line, you're going to be really brawling with your opponent because of how close you start to each other and how easily you can come to grips with each other. So that's Wedge. The next strategy we're going to be looking at, or the next, deployment zone we're going to be looking at is Standard. Now, Standard is what you might expect, if you are used to playing war games. Sorry, I'm just trying to tinker with it. Standard is a pretty normal deployment zone for anybody who's played, War Machine, Warhammer. A lot of those missions deploy in a similar way to this, where you have a line 8 inches out, and then you deploy everything behind that line. Now, like Wedge, this one's a horizontal deployment, which means that Guard the Stash will look like the previous one. Covert Operations will look like this. But unlike Wedge, you're not being funneled into the center. So on these strategies that are requiring you to interact with strategy markers that are spread out, you really will have an even chance to go for any of them first. You won't necessarily be funneled towards the two in the center. This also, you'll notice, has your deployment zones significantly farther apart. In wedge deployment, your deployment zones are 12 inches apart at the closest point. In standard deployment, your deployment zones are 20 inches apart at the closest point because it's a 36-inch board, 8 inches up, 8 inches up. That's pretty significant because it means that you don't have the ability to get to grips with your opponent quite as quickly. So if you are playing a crew like, Brewmaster and his monks, I'm going to set up here, who really kind of want to dirtle around a little bit on turn one, giving each other poison, you have the time to do that. But it also means that it takes you quite a bit longer to get up to the strategy markers, so you need to maybe plan it a bit in advance. Standard deployment is pretty straightforward. It's probably, if you're playing a test game, it's the deployment type that you will use, because it's easy to remember, and I don't think it necessarily favors some strategies over others, because this broad stretch of the deployment zone, where it's not farther out in any point than in any other point, means that you can go for any of the markers pretty much easily, as easily as any other. Next, we're going to talk about flank deployment. As you can see, I've got this flank deployment set up, and this is a guard the stash layout. Now, flank deployment is a diagonal deployment. Oh, this goes away, by the way. Flank deployment is a diagonal deployment. It has a much longer center line because it's the hypotenuse of the triangle rather than the diameter of the board. So one thing that you'll notice, for example, is that when you're playing on covert operations, which is going to have the markers be a bit more like this, they're really far apart. That means that models that are trying to score one marker can't really disrupt models that are trying to score another marker. And it also means that models that are trying to score one marker cannot then easily move to the next marker. So I'm actually going to set up some auras on these. This is something you can do when you are playing in Vassal that really helps you kind of measure with precision. That is where that strategy marker would go. This strategy marker would go up here. This strategy marker would go roughly here, and this strategy marker would go roughly there. So these four markers would be your four covert operations markers. Notice how far apart they are and how difficult it might be for a model that's really trying to command this marker to then go over and pick this one up. So you do need to have some planning ahead when you're doing covert operations on a diagonal deployment. Now, on the other hand, and I'm just going to clear these auras, if you look at these deployment zone Ls, these points in the center are actually the actual center of the table quarter. So when you are doing a deployment that involves placing a strategy marker in the center of each table quarter, which is, I believe, only guard the stash on this one, then you will have a marker in your deployment zone, which makes it fairly easy to defend. But it also means that there are, instead of 4 markers you can score, because you can't score markers on your table side, there are actually 5. So you actually have a little bit more flexibility to score points without necessarily having to contest your opponent right away with this strategy. And I think that means that there are more options for each opponent, or for each player to go to, and it will lead to maybe some more flexible games. And then finally, if you're looking at Carve a Path, you'll notice that this part of the deployment zone is actually pretty close to each other. I don't think it's quite as close as Wedge, but it is pretty close. And so it's not as hard to get the payload cart into your opponent's deployment zone as you might think. But that means you do have to aim for the corners. You can't go right for the center. And if you're a crew like Brewmaster who wants to do kind of a complicated unpack where you spend your first turn just poisoning each other, you can do it over here in relative safety before moving out. Whereas if you're doing a crew like Nekama that just wants to come to grips with your opponent, you can deploy out in the corners and just go running right into their face. So the last deployment we're going to look at is corner deployment. Now, corner deployment is like Wedge, or not like Wedge, sorry, like Flank, I'll just do it from the top. The last deployment we're going to look at is corner deployment. Now, corner deployment, like Flank, is a diagonal deployment. So this is what a guard the stash map will look like on corner deployment, fairly roughly. The big thing to notice about corner deployment is look how far the deployment zones are away from each other. They're really, really far. Those crews that want to unpack slowly, they love corner deployment because there's very little chance your opponent's going to come to grips with you turn one. Now, that does mean you might end up being pushed a little farther back and you'll lose some movement. So you do have to plan for that. But if you're just walking and focusing and doing that kind of thing, like a crew that wants to engage on turn two with a lot of focus already stacked, corner gives you the time to do that. However, because you're so far from the strategy markers, you might have to take quite a few walk actions to get to them. Now, the other thing to think about on corner, because of the distance of the deployment zones, is carve a path. It's going to take you a really long time to get those carts where they're going. Really, really long. So you really need to plan ahead, and you really need to be playing a mobile crew. If there are strategies that require you to push up the board, like carve a path, and to an extent, like guard the stash, you cannot afford to take slow crews on corner deployment. You can maybe afford to take a slow crew on Wedge because you start off so far advanced that you have plenty of time to get where you're going. But on corner deployment, you need to be moving. You need to be hustling to get there. And then finally, I'll just briefly touch on schemes. This isn't something that I think you can really make universal rules about with the deployment zones. But, for example, Sabotage. Sabotage wants you to pick a piece of terrain that's at least 4 inches away from the center line. Now, depending on whether the deployment is, a diagonal deployment like this or a standard size horizontal deployment, what pieces of terrain are eligible to be picked for Sabotage will vary. So you need to really be thinking when you see that scheme pool, when you see the table you're on, maybe there's this piece of terrain that's the perfect size and shape to drop scheme markers near, but it just isn't an eligible piece if you're playing on diagonal deployment, where it is eligible if you're playing on standard deployment. Those are just the type of considerations you need to have when you're deploying. So overall, I would say when you deploy, the number one thing to think about is how does this deployment affect strategy markers and how they're going to be placed and moved. Everyone's trying to score the strategy. That's how you win the game. And every strategy, except for cursed objects, does involve you planting some strategy markers. And so it's very relevant where they're going to be planted and how long it's going to take you to get to them, or how long it's going to take the markers to get to where they need to go. The second consideration is how close am I to my opponent? Is this deployment zone so close that I really don't have time to mess around and I need to just be engaging right away? Or is this deployment zone far enough that I can afford to kind of fiddle around a little? And if it is far, is this deployment zone so far that I really need to be taking those walk actions on turn one and pushing my models up just so that I don't get completely boxed out of scoring? Those are the types of considerations I think you should really try to keep in mind when you are looking at a scheme and strategy pool. And if you want shorthand, just think wedge, super close, flank, kind of close, standard, pretty far, corner, very far. That's sort of a very, very crude shorthand way of thinking about it, but it might at least get your mind oriented in the right direction. I hope this has been a useful discussion for you thinking about deployment zones. The fact that Malifaux has 4 incredibly different deployment zones and that each deployment zone, rather than being linked to a specific mission, is independent of the strategy and schemes that are being played, adds a lot of variety to the games and means that they never play out quite the same way. And mastering these deployment zones and figuring out what's the proper way to deploy and to make use of them is a real skill that you'll need to develop as you're leveling up your game. So we hope you like this video. Please, if you do, drop us a like, leave a comment if you think that maybe I missed something or if you have some insights about how best to use the deployment zones. And please subscribe if you like our content. There's a lot more coming. And of course, if you look in the description of this video, you can see our Discord where we talk about Malifaux and lots of other games, and we'd love to have you with us. So until next time, have fun playing, and I guess stay away from the danger planet. I still need to come up with a pretty good sign-off.
I'm saying something that sounds sexual.
I'm saying something that sounds like I'm using drugs.
I'm saying something that implies a dark past. That's when it's such a